Hello, welcome to today's HR Huddle. I'm Tamera Loerzel. With me is Samantha Mansfield. Thank you, Samantha, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Happy Monday.
Yes, you too. And we're here. We thought we would spend some time on something we do a lot of coaching on, both at the partner and leadership level, for sure, in our leadership programs. And given many of the firms we're working with, or portions of the firm, people in the firm are in some kind of deadline or peak period this time of year, we thought we would just take a few moments and talk about communication preferences and maybe how to pay attention to those as we're interacting with people, also under pressure. But just in general, I think it's something that's very important for us to consider is, we often lead and communicate from our own communication preferences, and then are surprised that it doesn't seem to work or there's disconnects with other people. And one of the tools that we use to identify and talk about communication preferences is personality assessments. Our go-to is Myers-Briggs, but we tend to use others like DISC and Strengths Finders, and we know there's many out there. But like I said, our go-to is Myers-Briggs, and so from HR and talent development and managing conflict that often we have to do in HR, and then also just as leaders in general, we thought it might be good to kind of pull apart some different preferences to identify yours, and then start to pay attention maybe more closely to other people's. And Samantha is a little bit close to this because she just got certified for Myers-Briggs this past week. So she's been in a very in-depth conversation about it. So it's on the tip of her tongue. And like I said, we just think communication is something that we always have to be paying attention to. And this just felt like a really good time to, bring it up and maybe remind us. And hopefully you can take some snippets away, both for yourself, but also for your team. I don't know if you're doing team huddles or anything that you might be doing that could remind them, of some of these ideas. So that's the topic. And I don't know, Samantha, if there's anything that you want to say from additional about setup or anything else, why this is important, or, anything to start there.
Well, I just think the other reason that we think communication is such a key point right now is because so much of the profession is really kind of hitting these critical points in deadlines. And so communication might be getting misinterpreted, and that just kind of adds to the stress. And so let's just clarify, remind ourselves that other people may just inherently communicate different than we do. And so it gives us a little more grace. And maybe we want to just even open that conversation and say, hey, I think you're doing this. Here's what I would really prefer. So how can we find that in between and just make it a nice working environment as you're working through such a busy time? So I think that's where it brings a lot of value in just opening up what our preferences are with each other.
Yeah, and maybe one of them that we start with that we talk about quite a bit is this idea of introversion and extroversion. And I think those are common terms, even if you're not actively using Myers-Briggs, because they're more socially maybe discussed and accepted, maybe not always defined correctly, we find. But when you think about, communication differences there, I think that's a good one. And introverts, it's really about, how you take in information, and then use it. And so introverts are more internal and then external and then internal, where extroverts are more external, talk, act, and then internal, reflect, and then external. And so that's a place where if an introvert has limited words. And so I'm an introvert and Samantha is an introvert, and some people are surprised by that. We can be extroverted. You can see us facilitate, you can see us, discuss and, talk and all of that. But at the end of the day, I know I have very little words left. And so I have to fill my bank back up. But also, I will, process or think of things later. And so, having the patience, for that, or setting up, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. So that introverts, can plan for it, I think is super important. An agenda, something to read in advance, something to prep. I think is important, for us, to think about when we can. Now, that said, we'll always say, and look at the other side of it, introverts, we have to look and say, how do we process information out loud in the meeting with the client? Because it's happening, or, business is happening real time, life is happening real time. And so, there is, a bit of both that needs to, happen. So we can look and say, how can we start to build the confidence to be able to do that? Or say, hey, give me a moment, I'm thinking about what you just said, or, things like that, so that we can problem solve, we can process, we can move things forward and not have to leave and come back and leave and come back. That's not, what I'm saying at all. So I think that's one place to look and just, identify, what is your, preferred way, of, discussing or you're talking through things, or if you prefer to have the information in advance, ask for it, those kinds of things. I think that's a really good place to start and identify what those differences might be.
Absolutely. I would say another element to keep in mind, like you said, Tamara, it takes time to be able to find that comfort in speaking off the cuff. And so when you are working with some introverts, what you might find is that you're going to get an email. It might be an hour after the meeting. It might be the next morning that starts with something like, I was thinking about yesterday's meeting and I had some thoughts. And that's fairly common. And so just keep that in mind, that instead of getting frustrated of saying, well, why didn't you say that in the meeting? Just know they're trying to get to that spot. And maybe help encourage them in the meeting. If you find somebody that tends to do that, maybe ask them if there's something at the end of the discussion that they would like to contribute, things along those lines, because it may be that they're just finding it difficult to even pop into the conversation. Maybe there's so much talking that they feel like they're interrupting somebody else and won't chime in. So just another piece to watch for and keep in mind. Another area is that as much as many of us dislike email, it's part of our lives. It's just part of how we communicate and live. And so a couple of things to be mindful of when we think of email communications and other styles is that we have some types of us, some personalities, and I say us because I can be this way, but we want to provide all the context around why I'm about to ask the question that I'm going to ask, or here's the answer to your question, but I told you the whole backstory before I ever got to that. So as a person that does that, what we have to realize is that not everybody wants to read all of that, and not everybody actually finds the value in it like we do. And so one quick tip, especially in these harried times where when you get a long email in your inbox, it can be like, I'm going to tuck that away until I actually have time, which might be the post busy season. And then the person who sent it is frustrated because they're not getting responses. So put the bottom line, put the ask at the top. Make sure that they know why are you sending this email right now? And what's the immediacy that you need in an answer? Put that up at the top. Then if they have time or they're interested in knowing more of the detail, put that underneath. And so the other people that value that like you do, they're going to be happy it's there. The people who just want that top line and move on, they're going to love your emails because they can get to that easily, get you your answer, which makes you happy, and then you can move on. So just another element to think about with email.
I think that's great. And I know some people say email's going to go away, but I'm not convinced of that either. I think we'll minimize and we'll use other tools, and there's collaboration tools that will remove some from the email. But I think the same point applies, whether you're using Teams or, another Slack or whatever it might be, that we've got to be really specific about what our ask is. And you just made me think of something, Samantha, is that what medium or what tool are we using? And email is a good transactional tool. Teams or Slack is a good collaborative tool. If we're trying to make decisions or solve problems, we might want to give some facts or information via those tools, and then live discussion, whether it's virtual, in person or, phone call or whatever, but some kind of discussion where we can have live discussion is probably better. And we know firsthand that that is a challenge. And we say we don't have time for meetings. But if we can be intentional, we can use the communication tools ahead of time. We can be more diligent in our meetings and more on time in our meetings, those kinds of things to actually get things done, make decisions, solve problems, progress, maybe initiatives we're working on, however we're using those meetings. Maybe there's performance feedback or, we're doing some training. There's things we can do with other tools, but then when we're live, we can, be more intentional about how we use that time. But I know for just time's sake, sometimes we get this long length of, strand of emails, or, it can start to get heated, and it doesn't need to be, because we're just going back and forth, and tone is tough in writing, compared to live. I mean, we still need to manage tone and volume and all those things when we're speaking, but I think it's easier to manage. And I can see facial expressions and all of those things. All of that is missing in the written form. So that's something else to pay attention to. And again, during peak periods, I can just, snap off an email just for efficiency's sake, not stopping to think about tone or stopping to think how it might be interpreted. And it's not interpreted on how I'm intending it. It's interpreted over there. And so I have to be really intentional about how I'm writing that and pay special attention to tone. I know for me, I'm probably better off writing it in the morning when I'm fresh than at night when I'm like done. So, looking at your biological clock and your time, that you like to, write things or, speak or be productive or those kinds of things. We call it flow time and time management. I think is important too, but there's so much we could do to minimize maybe miscommunication if we pay attention to those things.
Yeah, and there's some ways that you can use the technology too. So to your point, Tamara, I mean, sometimes I want to write the email when the input or everything is fresh in my mind, but maybe I'm frustrated with even having to answer the question for the umpteenth time. And so what I might need to do is I can write it, but then let me put it in my draft and look at it in the morning, right? And just get that fresh perspective. The other piece is that the technology component, besides using our draft, is to use the read aloud feature within Outlook. And in our minds, we know how we want that to sound, but even using like Outlook read aloud, you can sit there and say, whoa, okay, that is not what I would want that to sound like to the other person. And, sometimes we need to hear it in that auditory without our mind's interpretation as we're writing it. So a couple of tools that if you find yourself in that situation, great to be able to use. Another one, and you started referencing this, but I just wanted to spell it out specifically, is ending email chains. Because sometimes we just get these enormously long email chains at the back and forth, and you see it, like you said, Tamara, start heating up where you start seeing the frustration, and it's just time to call a timeout and say, we need to have a conversation. And let's not, because something is getting missed, or it really takes being able to go back and forth instead of referencing your bullet point 3, here's my response and all of that, where then it just gets very difficult to manage. And so, a good rule of thumb is if you're discussing something and you're on the third email going back and forth discussing it, it's time to just say, hey, let's have a quick chat, and maybe we can do that via Teams and just chat, even if it's audio. But let's just have a quick chat. Let's resolve this and put this to bed instead of furthering the email chain. And that's something that I think we don't really think of enough. And we just think, well, I just got to keep it here in email. But after you have that conversation, then recap it. Follow up on the chain with here's our conversation, here's what we just agreed on. And then we still have that documented. And anybody else that needs to know it, it's documented. We have it. We can share it with them. And we don't start this process over again with somebody else.
Yeah.
So Another piece, like you said, I just last week was in a training, really all about kind of our differences, and we've been doing so much in the dialogue about diversity. And one of the pieces that we talked about last week is how cultures, and it can be the country, but it can even be within the region of a country that we're in, can really influence the way that we communicate as well. And so, with so many people working with others that are either in other parts of the country or around the world, that's something for us to be mindful of as well. Is that instead of going right to that interpretation of, oh my gosh, that was rude, or why would they say it that way? That could very much be a cultural element that is just not familiar to me. And so, just giving each other some grace and let's clarify, as opposed to jumping right to an assumption that that came across as terse or rude or however it may hit you. Let's ask about that before we jump and create that anxiety and nagging mental dialogue.
That's so funny. I was at a weekend with a bunch of women in my running group, and we were very clear up front, that it's really, participate where you want to participate. And nothing, is obligatory. And one of the evenings, it was somebody, was gone, and we're like, did she go to bed? Did she go for a walk? Like, what happened? And then somebody said it's like the Irish goodbye. Like there was no goodbye. It was like leave, stage left. And it's not the Minnesota goodbye where I am from, which is an hour. We have to go say goodbye to everybody, probably twice. My husband is very much a Minnesota goodbye.
Mhm.
But we call that also, like, there's warm up, like there's niceties.
Mhm.
And part of it's cultural, but it's what made me think about it. Part of it, I think, is cultural.
Yes.
Part of it's personality. Part of it's just kind of how we grew up. And but we make interpretations about it.
Yes.
And so, paying attention to that, because I might be with a group of people that prefer niceties or prefer warm up. On the Myers-Briggs, the feelers like that warm up, that personal, discussion. It's not that the opposite of F is thinkers don't have warm up or don't care about those things. We don't start with it. And so just knowing that, I think, is important. And saying good morning, and we can do that. I know that's more difficult in our hybrid environment, but I can say good morning on Teams. Sarah was out there saying good morning to me, and she had some questions, and how was your weekend? And I saw pictures, and and warm up's important to her. And so we had some dialogue about the weekend, and it was all electronic, digital, on Teams. And it was really great. And then we got down to business, really quick, and addressed whatever questions she had, and moved on to our day. And it's Monday, and there's lots happening. And so that warm up, though, those niceties and that warm up, and we have to, not only be careful about our interpretations about it,
Mhm.
because they're different of ours, but try to pay attention to what others like around that. And then we can ask about it if we have something we prefer differently, or, we can also accommodate and try to provide that, when possible too. So I think that's important as well.
Absolutely. And with the team that you work with closest and clients that you work with regularly, it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask what their communication preference is. Do you prefer that we have a phone conversation? Do you want everything via email? Do you like a bullet pointed list more than the full explanation? It's okay to go ahead and ask those questions. And I think sometimes we feel like we're not allowed to do that, or you just have to kind of figure it
Figure
out.
it out. Yes.
Right. But I think people feel valued if we go ahead and ask what their preference is. And then, we can try and accommodate to that. It doesn't always work, but when we show that we're making that effort to accommodate to their communication preference, then that also makes it that they're going to be more willing to lean our way when we have to go outside that norm as well. So I just wanted to say that absolutely we can ask, and not feel that that's like a question that we shouldn't ever do.
Yes. And so it's a good practice to do that, like at the kickoff of an engagement. And you might go, Samantha and I have been working together for a few years, but maybe Samantha and Sarah and I haven't worked together in a few years. And we do all have different, styles and preferences. It might be good to agree on it. And, and there's going to be some give and take on that, but also ask the client, what are your preferences? Now, if they would say, I'd prefer to text you, we might say we only use text for, we might not, it's not might. We would say we use text for breakthrough, communication only. We do not use text as a regular way to communicate with our team or with our clients, unless we're traveling or, maybe we're doing co-facilitation and we'll have that, but we agree on that up front. So, identify what the communication preferences are, and or if you have an approach that you use for communication, share that with your clients so they're not surprised and say, is there something else that you would prefer? I think that's important. And while you're talking about expectations, Sam, one of the things I'm going to be writing about in my upcoming blog is in our Anytime, Anywhere work survey, we asked the question about documenting expectations about hybrid and remote, anytime, anywhere work. And it was shocking. More than half of the firms don't really have documented expectations, and you start going down into detail about guidelines and about response time, and then we're disappointed and upset and say it doesn't work, but we haven't stopped and stepped back and said, what are our expectations, and are we communicating those both at the firm level and then, to your point, at the team level? And so I think that's important as well, since I can't necessarily see people, I can't walk down the hall and figure it out. We've got to get better about that, but that's also how we need to figure out how to work with our clients too. So it is appropriate to document those expectations, agree on those, and then we can manage against them. And where there's exceptions, we can identify those and implement those too.
And set realistic expectations.
Yes.
Don't offer what you think they want to hear. Set what's really realistic, because then you're just putting yourself in a pressure cooker of, right, I've got all of this and I said that I would do it. Or gradually you said one thing, but you gradually kept changing what your delivery was. Well, they're going to believe your actions over your words. And so make sure that you honor what you said as well, so that you don't change expectations, though you never meant to.
Right.
And that's internally with your team as well.
Yep.
I just had a conversation with someone today that was asking, oh, I really want to take a real vacation this year and not have to work while I'm on vacation. And how do I do that? And part of that is really what you communicate before you go on vacation and how you line things up and setting expectation well in advance, and then honor the boundaries that you set. And not respond if you said you're not going to be responding and so forth. But the principle of that on a day-to-day basis is exactly the same.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I think during like these peak periods, you said something, towards the beginning of this HR huddle about, maybe I'm not going to respond until after busy season. And so, really managing those communications. And if I'm not going to focus on it, let people know. And so sometimes we don't respond because I don't have an answer, or I can't really get to it, or I can't read that lengthy email right now, but I can respond and say, hey, Samantha, I got this. And I'm going to look at it, after the 15th. So I'll look at it, this weekend, by the 17th or 18th, and make sure that works for you. Now, counter to that, if Samantha needed it before that, hopefully she would give me a buy-when date, which I know I'm guilty of not always consistently providing. And so, but we can clarify that. We leave people hanging. I think that's one of the things about communications, is to look and see where we can close that gap. So people aren't feeling like they're being ignored, or it's in the black hole, or I don't know how to prioritize. And especially with your team, they don't know how to prioritize if they're not getting buy-when dates, if they're not getting responses back. They don't know what they can defer, or that you're deferring, so then they can move on to something else. And that's just good etiquette. But good collaboration. And so, maybe letting go of, I can't respond to things until I've got it all organized. And part of that, again, is our personality preferences and how we're wired. But, part of it is back to this expectations idea, respond and, acknowledge that you received it and when you're going to get to it. And again, with clients as well, and set that expectation with clients so that they respond to us. Sarah and I were working on something with a coaching client today, and it's like, we need to put a by when date for her to respond to us, Sarah. We're not being clear about that. And so she's off there working on it, but we didn't know that. And so we were trying to schedule some things. And so how can we tighten up that communication, and not to be like rigorous or strict or rigid or anything like that, but it's workability, the count on ability. I know what I can count on and expect. They know what we're counting on. They know what they can count on also. So it's just workability all around.
Yep. And I think that's just the last thing I would say to that is just making sure that you establish that with your team, that it's not micromanaging you, or like we said, some personalities, it stresses them out having so much structure. So we need to really communicate with the team. Here's why we're doing this is so that we've got that count on ability and we're not checking in with each other unnecessarily, which just adds more time and unnecessary email again.
Exactly. So hopefully, I guess, you could tell Samantha and I could go on with for a long time. This communication is super important, but hopefully you got some ideas you can take back and go, gosh, this would be really good to reinforce, or maybe it made you think of some other ideas. We'd love to hear what they are too, just to elevate, enhance communication when we feel like we don't have time to communicate, but just in general as well. So hopefully this was helpful. And thank you for being with us this week. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. We are going to take a hiatus next week because we are going to be in our company's strategic planning meeting. A subgroup of us are going to meet together. And so we'll see you in 2 weeks. And I hope you have a great rest of the month, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.